The German patrol moved through the Belgian forest like shadows at dusk, 8 men in Feldgrau uniforms, boots crunching frost-hardened leaves. In the oak tree 30 yards above them, Corporal Eddie Brennan held his breath, finger resting against the cold trigger guard of his Springfield Oro 3. He'd had the lead scout in his crosshairs for 2 full minutes. An easy shot, center mass, maybe 180 yards when the column first appeared. But Eddie hadn't fired. The squad below carried something strapped to the back of the rearmost soldier. A canvas bundle, man-sized, sagging with dead weight. Through his scope, Eddie could see dried blood on the fabric, dark as motor oil. Dog tags glinted at the bundle's edge. American dog tags. The Germans stopped directly beneath his position now, close enough that Eddie could hear their labored breathing, see the steam rising from their collars. The squad leader raised one gloved hand. They were setting down for a rest. Eddie's jaw tightened. His spotter, Private Kowalski, lay frozen on the branch beside him, eyes wide with the terrible mathematics of their situation. 8 armed enemy soldiers, 2 Americans, and whatever they were carrying in that blood-stained canvas, it changed everything. Eddie Brennan had been in that oak tree for 6 hours before the Germans appeared. He'd climbed up in the dark before dawn, his rifle strapped across his back and his hands numb even through the wool gloves. Kowalski had followed, slower, breathing hard. They'd settled into position as the first gray light filtered through the bare branches, and they'd waited. That's what snipers did. They waited. Eddie was good at waiting, better than most. He'd grown up hunting deer in the Adirondacks, sitting motionless in a blind for hours, watching the tree line until his father would finally whisper that it was time to head home. The forest below them had been quiet all morning. Too quiet. Third Army intelligence said the Germans were pulling back toward the Siegfried Line, trying to regroup after the push through France. But Eddie had learned not to trust intelligence reports. He trusted what he could see through his scope, what he could hear in the silence between heartbeats. And right now, what he saw made his gut tighten. The German squad leader was young, maybe 22, with a thin face and hollow eyes. He sat down heavily on a fallen log, unslung his Kar 98K, and rubbed his temples like a man fighting off a headache. Kowalski shifted slightly on the branch beside Eddie. The movement was barely perceptible, but Eddie felt it through the wood. His spotter was 18, fresh from Brooklyn, still jumpy. Eddie had requested an experienced man, but experienced men were in short supply these days. Most of them were dead. Kowalski had good eyes, though. Sharp, and he knew when to keep his mouth shut. That counted for something. Eddie could see the kid's knuckles white against the bark, could hear the shallow breathing that Kowalski was trying hard to control. The Germans were speaking now, low voices that drifted up through the cold air. Eddie didn't speak German, but he recognized the tone. Exhausted men, arguing quietly about something. One of them, a broad-shouldered sergeant with a scarred cheek, pointed back the way they'd come and shook his head. Another soldier, barely more than a boy, started unwrapping something from his pack. Bread, it looked like. Hard rations. They were settling in. Eddie watched the squad leader stand and walk over to the canvas bundle. He crouched beside it, placed one hand on the fabric, and bowed his head. That gesture changed everything. It wasn't the movement of a man checking cargo. It was something else, something personal. Eddie felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He adjusted his scope fractionally, bringing the bundle into sharper focus. The bloodstains were old, dried to a rust color, but the dog tags were new enough to catch the weak winter light. He could see the chain, the rectangular metal tags hanging free where the canvas had pulled loose. American. Definitely American. And the way the bundle sagged, the way it lay against the frozen ground, there was a body inside. Kowalski had seen it too. Eddie heard the kid's breathing change, faster now, edging toward panic. Eddie reached out slowly and pressed 2 fingers against Kowalski's wrist. The signal was clear. Stay calm. Stay still. The kid nodded once, jerky, and forced his breathing to slow. Below them, the German sergeant stood and said something sharp. 2 soldiers jumped to their feet. They lifted the canvas bundle between them, careful, almost reverent, and moved it closer to the center of their circle. The squad leader barked an order. The men formed up around the bundle, rifles ready, facing outward. Eddie had been a sniper for 11 months. He'd taken 37 confirmed kills. maybe more. He knew how to calculate wind drift and bullet drop, how to control his breathing, how to squeeze a trigger so smoothly the rifle barely moved. But he'd never been taught what to do when the enemy carried your dead. The rule book didn't cover this. You took the shot, eliminated the threat, completed the mission. But something about this moment felt different, felt wrong. These men weren't advancing. They weren't attacking. They were protecting something, someone, and Eddie needed to know who. The German boy with the bread tore off a piece and offered it to the squad leader, who waved it away. The kid sat back down, chewing slowly, staring at the canvas bundle. Eddie studied the boy's face through his scope. 16, maybe 17. Scared. They were all scared, actually. Eddie could see it in the way they held their weapons, the way they kept glancing over their shoulders. These weren't SS fanatics. These were Wehrmacht regulars, probably conscripts, boys from farms and villages who'd been handed rifles and told to hold the line. They were losing. They knew it. And still they carried that body. A cold wind moved through the forest, rattling the bare branches. Eddie's hands ached from gripping the rifle, from holding the same position for so long. He flexed his fingers carefully, one at a time, keeping the Springfield steady. Beside him, Kowalski whispered, "Eddie, we gotta report this." Eddie shook his head once. Not yet. Reporting meant calling it in on the radio, and the radio was in Kowalski's pack, and getting to the pack meant movement, noise. The Germans were 40 feet below them now. Any sound would give them away, and Eddie wasn't ready to be given away, not until he understood what was happening down there. The German squad leader stood again and pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing it against his thigh. A map, Eddie realized, or maybe orders. The man studied it for a long moment, then looked up toward the ridge to the east. He said something to the sergeant, who nodded and gestured for 2 men to move forward as scouts. They went reluctantly, rifles raised, picking their way through the underbrush. The rest of the squad stayed put, guarding the bundle. Eddie tracked the scouts with his scope until they disappeared into the tree line, then swung back to the main group. That's when he saw the patch. The squad leader had turned slightly, and the winter light caught the insignia on his collar. Not Wehrmacht, not regular army. Feldgendarmerie, military police. Eddie's pulse quickened. Military police didn't run patrols this deep into contested territory. They handled deserters, black market operations, civilian enforcement. They weren't frontline troops. So what was a Feldgendarmerie officer doing in the middle of the Ardennes forest, carrying an American body? Eddie watched the man fold the map and put it back in his pocket. The officer's hand trembled slightly. Fear, maybe. Or exhaustion. Or something else. Kowalski's hand moved to his canteen. Eddie caught the motion and stopped him with a look. No water, no food, no movement at all until they figured this out. The kid pulled his hand back, frustrated but obedient. Below them, one of the German soldiers lit a cigarette, cupping the flame carefully. The smoke drifted up through the branches, sharp and acrid. Eddie smelled it and fought the urge to cough. His throat was dry, his legs cramping from the awkward position on the branch. But he didn't move. Couldn't move. Not yet. The 2 scouts hadn't returned. That meant they were still sweeping the area, checking for threats. If Eddie and Kowalski stayed absolutely still, they'd be invisible. The German officer knelt beside the canvas bundle again. This time, he reached out and pulled the fabric back, just slightly, revealing what was inside. Eddie's breath caught. It was a man. An American soldier, still in uniform. The face was turned away, but Eddie could see the rank on the shoulder. Captain. The officer stared at the dead captain for a long moment, then covered him again. He stood slowly, his hand resting on the grip of his Luger. He said something to his men, quiet words that Eddie couldn't hear, but he saw the way the soldiers straightened, the way they gripped their rifles tighter. Whatever the officer had said, it had changed the atmosphere. The air felt heavier now. Dangerous. The scouts emerged from the tree line, moving fast. They reported something to the officer, gesturing back toward the ridge. The officer nodded and gave an order. The squad began to pack up, slinging rifles, adjusting gear. They lifted the canvas bundle again, 2 men on each side, and started moving east, toward the ridge, toward American lines. Eddie watched them go, his mind racing. They were carrying a dead American captain deep into enemy territory, moving carefully, protecting the body like it mattered, like it was worth dying for. And Eddie still didn't know why. He waited until the last German disappeared into the trees, then lowered his rifle and looked at Kowalski. The kid's face was pale. "What the hell was that?" Kowalski whispered. Eddie shook his head. He didn't have an answer, not yet, but he knew one thing. They couldn't let that patrol reach wherever they were going, not without knowing what they were carrying and why. He reached for the radio in Kowalski's pack and hesitated. Standard procedure was to call it in, let command handle it. But something in his gut told him this wasn't standard. This was something else, something that required a different kind of response. Eddie clipped the radio back onto the pack and started climbing down from the tree. Kowalski followed, confused. When they reached the ground, Eddie checked his rifle and started moving east, tracking the Germans. "Where are we going?" Kowalski hissed. Eddie didn't look back. "We're following them." They moved through the forest like ghosts, staying 50 yards behind the German patrol. Eddie kept to the low ground, using the terrain for cover, his eyes never leaving the backs of the enemy soldiers ahead. Kowalski followed close, his breathing too loud in the cold air. Eddie signaled him twice to slow down, to control it. The kid was nervous, had every right to be. They were deep in contested territory now, no support, no backup, tracking an enemy unit that outnumbered them 4-1. If the Germans turned around, if they spotted movement, Eddie and Kowalski would be dead before they could raise their rifles. But Eddie kept moving. He had to know. The German patrol stopped at a bombed-out farmhouse. The walls collapsed on one side. The roof caved in. The Feldgendarmerie officer raised his hand and the squad took up defensive positions around the perimeter. 2 men carried the canvas bundle inside through what remained of the doorway. Eddie and Kowalski went to ground behind a fallen tree 40 yards out, watching through the scope. Eddie could see movement inside the farmhouse, shadows crossing the broken windows. The officer was talking to someone. Eddie couldn't see who. Then another figure emerged from the darkness inside. A German officer in a clean uniform. No mud, no wear. Staff officer, Eddie realized. High-ranking. The staff officer walked to the canvas bundle and knelt beside it. He pulled back the fabric, same as the Feldgendarmerie officer had done in the forest, and stared at the dead American captain's face. He said something to the Feldgendarmerie officer, his voice too low to carry. But Eddie saw the gesture, the staff officer placing his hand over his heart, then touching the dead man's shoulder. It was a gesture of respect, maybe more than respect. Recognition. Eddie's mind raced. The staff officer knew the dead American, knew him personally. This wasn't just about recovering an enemy body. This was something else, something that connected these 2 officers across the battle lines. Kowalski whispered, "Eddie, we should call this in now." Eddie nodded slowly. The kid was right. This was intelligence. Important intelligence. He pulled the radio from Kowalski's pack and keyed the transmitter twice, the signal for their command post. Static crackled back, then a voice. "Crossbow 2, this is Able 6. Send your traffic." Eddie kept his voice low, barely audible. "Able 6, we have eyes on enemy patrol, 8 men, Feldgendarmerie unit carrying American KIA. Meeting with German staff officer at grid 479 or 231, requesting instructions." The radio went silent for a long moment. Then, "Crossbow 2, maintain observation, do not engage. Reinforcements en route, ETA 30 minutes. 30 minutes was a lifetime in a situation like this. Eddie clipped the radio back on and settled in, watching the farmhouse. The staff officer was still inside, still talking to the Feldgendarmerie officer. The other German soldiers sat outside, smoking, eating their rations, keeping watch. They looked exhausted, beaten down. One of them, the young kid with the bread, kept glancing back at the farmhouse door, his face pale. Eddie studied him through the scope. The kid was scared of something, not of getting shot, something else. Something inside that farmhouse. Eddie shifted his aim to the windows, trying to see more. The shadows moved again. The staff officer stood and gestured sharply. An argument, maybe. Then the shot rang out. A single pistol report, muffled by the farmhouse walls but unmistakable. The German soldiers outside jumped to their feet, rifles ready. The Feldgendarmerie sergeant shouted something and two men rushed inside. Eddie's finger moved to his trigger. Kowalski tensed beside him. "What the hell just happened?" the kid whispered. Eddie didn't answer. He was watching the doorway, waiting. The two German soldiers emerged, moving fast, and behind them came the Feldgendarmerie officer. He was alone, no staff officer. The officer barked orders and his men started packing up, quick and efficient. Something had changed. Something had gone very wrong in that farmhouse. Eddie made a decision. "Stay here," he told Kowalski. "Keep eyes on them. If they move out, track them." Kowalski grabbed his arm. "Where you going?" Eddie pulled free. "I need to see what's inside that house." He moved before the kid could argue, circling wide through the trees, using the terrain to stay hidden. The Germans were focused on their officer, on following orders, on getting ready to move. Eddie reached the back of the farmhouse and slipped through a gap in the collapsed wall. Inside, the smell hit him first. Cordite, blood, wet plaster. He moved through the rubble carefully, rifle raised, until he saw the body. The German staff officer lay on his back on the floor, a pistol near his right hand, a bullet hole in his temple. Suicide. Eddie's breath caught. He knelt beside the body and saw the insignia on the collar. Oberstleutnant, Lieutenant Colonel, high-ranking enough to have access to intelligence, to operational plans, to things that mattered. Eddie searched the body quickly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. He found a wallet with photographs, a woman, two children, a house in some German town. He found orders, stamped and signed, authorizing the recovery of the American captain's body. And he found a letter, handwritten, folded carefully in the inside pocket of the officer's coat. Eddie opened the letter. It was in German, but some words were clear enough. Names, dates, the American captain's name, Mitchell, Captain Robert Mitchell, and beneath it, another name that made Eddie's blood run cold. Oberst Heinrich Kellner, the staff officer's name. The letter was old, dated 1936, before the war. Eddie couldn't read most of it, but he understood enough. These two men, Mitchell and Kellner, had known each other before the war. Friends, maybe. Colleagues. And now one was dead and the other had just put a bullet in his own head rather than face whatever came next. Eddie folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He took the orders too, and the photographs. Then he heard the voices outside getting louder. The Germans were moving out. Eddie moved fast, slipping back through the gap in the wall, circling back toward Kowalski's position. He reached the fallen tree just as the patrol started east again, carrying the canvas bundle. But something was different now. The Feldgendarmerie officer walked at the front, his shoulders hunched, his hand resting on his Luger. He looked like a man walking to his execution. The other soldiers followed in silence. No talking, no smoking. The mood had shifted. Whatever had happened in that farmhouse, whatever that staff officer's death meant, it had shaken them. Eddie watched them disappear into the trees, then looked at Kowalski. "We need to follow them all the way." Kowalski's face was white. "Eddie, reinforcements are coming. We're supposed to wait." Eddie shook his head. "We can't wait. That officer back there killed himself for a reason. Whatever's going on here, it's bigger than a body recovery. We need to know where they're taking Mitchell." He stood and started moving, following the German patrol. Kowalski hesitated, then followed. They tracked the patrol for another 20 minutes, moving through denser forest now, the terrain getting rougher. Eddie could hear water ahead, a stream, maybe a river. The Germans were heading for a crossing point. That made sense. They were trying to get back to their own lines before American forces could intercept them. The forest opened up onto a narrow valley with a stream running through it. The Germans stopped at the water's edge. The Feldgendarmerie officer pulled out his map again and studied it, then pointed downstream. They started moving along the bank, slower now, more cautious. Eddie and Kowalski paralleled them from the tree line, staying hidden. That's when Eddie saw the bridge. It was small, wooden, barely wide enough for a vehicle, but it was intact. The Germans would cross there. And on the other side, Eddie could see movement. More German soldiers, a defensive position. The patrol was almost home, almost safe. Eddie's mind worked fast. Once they crossed that bridge, they'd be out of reach. Whatever answers Mitchell's body held, whatever reason Kellner had killed himself, it would disappear into German territory. Eddie made another decision. We're going to intercept them before they cross. Kowalski stared at him. Eddie, that's suicide. There's 8 of them, and now there's more on the other side. Eddie checked his rifle. We're not going to fight them. We're going to talk to them. He started moving down toward the stream, staying low. Kowalski grabbed his shoulder. Talk to them. Are you out of your mind? Eddie looked back. That officer back there didn't kill himself because he was afraid of being captured. He killed himself because of what Mitchell's body represents, because of what he knew. And that Feldgendarmerie officer knows it too. I saw his face. He's not going to cross that bridge. He's going to do something else. They moved closer, positioning themselves on a small ridge overlooking the stream. Eddie could see the German patrol clearly now, 30 yards away. The Feldgendarmerie officer had stopped again. He was staring at the bridge, at the soldiers on the other side, and his hand was on his Luger. The other men in his squad were watching him, confused. The sergeant said something, a question. The officer didn't answer. He just stood there, frozen. Eddie raised his rifle, not aiming at the officer, but ready. Kowalski did the same. The moment stretched out, tense and fragile. Then the officer did something that Eddie didn't expect. He knelt beside the canvas bundle and uncovered Mitchell's face. He said something in German, quiet words that Eddie couldn't hear, and then he stood and drew his Luger. But he didn't point it at the bridge. He pointed it at his own men. The German soldiers backed away, shocked, raising their hands. The sergeant started talking fast, trying to reason with him. The officer shook his head. He said something sharp, an order. The soldiers dropped their rifles and stepped back. The officer kept the Luger trained on them, then looked up toward the ridge, directly at Eddie. And Eddie understood. The officer had known they were there all along. He'd known Eddie and Kowalski were tracking them. And now he was making a choice. He was choosing not to cross that bridge. He was choosing to surrender Mitchell's body, to surrender himself. Eddie stood slowly, keeping his rifle lowered, and stepped out of the tree line. Kowalski hissed, "Eddie, what are you doing?" Eddie didn't answer. He walked down the ridge toward the stream, toward the German officer who stood there with a pistol in one hand, and the weight of impossible choices on his shoulders. The officer watched Eddie approach. He didn't raise the Luger, didn't fire. He just waited. When Eddie was 10 feet away, the officer spoke in accented English. "You are the sniper, from the tree." Eddie nodded. "I am." The officer's jaw tightened. "I let you live. In the forest. I saw you. I could have ordered my men to fire." Eddie kept his voice steady. "Why didn't you?" The officer looked down at Mitchell's covered face. "Because he was my friend." The words hung in the cold air. Eddie glanced at the German soldiers standing with their hands up, at the sergeant who looked confused and angry, at the young kid who looked terrified. Then he looked back at the officer. "Kellner was your friend too." The officer's hand trembled. "Yes, we were all friends. Before." He gestured at the canvas bundle. "Robert Mitchell saved my life in 1937, in Berlin. I was Gestapo then, before the war, and I learned something I should not have learned. About the party, about what was coming. Robert was American intelligence. He got me out. He saved me. And Heinrich," his voice broke. "Heinrich was his contact, his friend. We all believed the war could be stopped. We were fools." Eddie felt the weight of the letter in his pocket. Kellner killed himself because he couldn't face what comes next. The officer nodded. He killed himself because if Berlin learns what he did, what we all did, they will kill his family, my family, everyone we love. Eddie heard movement behind him. Kowalski had come down from the ridge, rifle ready. The German soldiers on the far side of the bridge had noticed something was wrong. They were starting to move, coming across. Eddie had seconds to make a decision. He looked at the Feldgendarmerie officer, at the pistol in his hand, at Mitchell's body lying on the cold ground between them. And he understood what this man was asking for. Protection, asylum, a chance to keep his family safe. Eddie made the hardest call of his life. "Lower your weapon. Tell your men to stay where they are. We're taking you in, all of you." The officer's eyes widened. "You cannot protect us. Berlin will find us." Eddie stepped closer. "Berlin won't find you. Because we're going to make sure nobody knows you surrendered. We're going to make it look like you died fighting." The German officer stared at Eddie for a long moment. Then he lowered the Luger. He turned to his men and spoke in German, sharp orders that made them stiffen. The sergeant started to protest, but the officer cut him off with a gesture. The young kid looked like he might cry. Slowly, one by one, the German soldiers raised their hands higher. The officer turned back to Eddie. "How do we do this?" Eddie glanced at the bridge. The German soldiers from the other side were halfway across now, moving cautiously, rifles raised. They'd heard something, seen something. In 30 seconds, they'd be close enough to engage. Eddie pulled Kowalski close. "Get on the radio. Tell Able 6 we have enemy contact at the bridge. Multiple hostiles. Tell them we're engaging." Kowalski fumbled with the radio, his hands shaking. He keyed the transmitter. Able 6, this is Crossbow 2. We have enemy contact at grid 479er245. Multiple hostiles approaching. Engaging now." The radio crackled back immediately. "Crossbow 2, negative, do not engage. Reinforcements are 5 minutes out." But Eddie had already raised his rifle. He fired once, twice, 3 times. The shots echoed across the valley. The German soldiers on the bridge dove for cover, returning fire wild and panicked. Eddie fired again, aiming high, not trying to hit anyone, just creating chaos, noise, a firefight that would be heard by the approaching American forces. The Feldgendarmerie officer understood. He shouted at his men and they dropped flat, making themselves small targets, playing their part. The firefight lasted 2 minutes. Eddie and Kowalski fired from the ridge, the Germans on the bridge fired back, and the Feldgendarmerie patrol stayed down, protected by the stream bank. Then Eddie heard the sound he'd been waiting for. American voices shouting, boots crashing through the underbrush. The reinforcements had arrived. A full platoon, 40 men, led by a lieutenant Eddie didn't recognize. They came in fast and professional, spreading out, taking firing positions. The lieutenant slid down next to Eddie. "Corporal Brennan?" Eddie nodded. "Sir, enemy patrol attempting to cross the bridge. We engaged. They've got 8 men down by the stream. Another squad on the far side." The lieutenant raised his binoculars, scanning the scene. His face hardened. "That's a body they're carrying. American." Eddie nodded. "Captain Mitchell, sir. KIA. The enemy was transporting him." The lieutenant lowered the binoculars. "We need to recover him, and we need prisoners. Can you give me covering fire?" Eddie glanced at the Feldgendarmerie officer lying by the stream. The man was watching him, waiting. Eddie made eye contact and gave the slightest nod. Then he turned back to the lieutenant. "Yes, sir. We've got them pinned. They're not going anywhere." The lieutenant barked orders. A squad moved forward, rifles raised, advancing on the German position. The Feldgendarmerie officer stood slowly, hands raised high, shouting in German. His men stood too, all of them, hands up, no resistance. The American soldiers closed in fast, disarming them, checking for weapons. One soldier pulled the canvas bundle back and confirmed. "It's Mitchell, sir." "It's the captain." The lieutenant moved down to the stream. He stood in front of the Feldgendarmerie officer, studying him. "You speak English?" The officer nodded. "Yes." The lieutenant's voice was cold. "Why were you transporting an American officer's body?" The officer met his gaze. "We were ordered to return him for burial. It was a matter of honor." The lieutenant's jaw tightened. "Honor? You people don't know the meaning of the word." The officer didn't flinch. "Perhaps not anymore. But once we did." The lieutenant turned away, disgusted. He gestured to his men. "Take them back to the CP and get Mitchell ready for transport. He's going home." The soldiers moved to comply, surrounding the German prisoners. Eddie watched it all happen, feeling the weight of what he'd just done. As the prisoners were being led away, the Feldgendarmerie officer looked back at Eddie one last time. Their eyes met across the distance. The officer's expression was unreadable. Gratitude, maybe, or resignation. Eddie nodded once, slightly. The officer returned it. Then he was gone, marching up the ridge with his men, surrounded by American soldiers. Kowalski stood next to Eddie, shaking his head. "I don't understand what just happened." Eddie checked his rifle, ejecting the magazine. "We saved some lives. That's all." The kid looked at him. "Those are enemy soldiers, Eddie. Why didn't we just take them out in the forest?" Eddie reloaded, his hands steady. "Because sometimes the war's bigger than one firefight, kid. Sometimes you have to think about what comes after." The lieutenant came back up the ridge. He was holding the letter Eddie had taken from Kellner's body. Eddie had slipped it to one of the soldiers during the chaos, making sure it got to the right hands. The lieutenant looked at Eddie with new eyes. "Corporal Brennan, this letter, where did you get it?" Eddie kept his voice neutral. "Found it in the farmhouse where the enemy made contact with a staff officer. The staff officer killed himself. The letter was on his body." The lieutenant read it again, slowly. "This is intelligence gold. This proves there was a resistance network operating inside German military intelligence before the war. Mitchell was running it." He looked up. "Did you read this?" Eddie nodded. "Some of it, sir. My German's not great." The lieutenant folded the letter carefully. "This letter names names. People in Berlin who were working against Hitler. If this information gets out, if Berlin finds out who betrayed them, they'll execute everyone connected to this network. Families, children, everyone." He looked at the German prisoners being loaded into trucks down below. "Those men down there, they were part of it, weren't they?" Eddie chose his words carefully. "I believe the Feldgendarmerie officer knew Mitchell before the war, sir. He was trying to return the body as a final gesture. That's all I know." The lieutenant studied him. "That's all you know." It wasn't a question. Eddie held his gaze. "Yes, sir." The lieutenant nodded slowly. "Good. Because, officially, what happened here was a routine enemy contact. We engaged a German patrol. They surrendered. We recovered Captain Mitchell's body. No intelligence value, no resistance network, no names. Understood?" Eddie understood perfectly. "Yes, sir." The lieutenant put the letter in his pocket. "I'll make sure this gets to the right people, people who can use it without getting anyone killed." He started to walk away, then stopped. "Corporal Brennan, there's something you should know about Captain Mitchell." Eddie waited. The lieutenant's voice softened slightly. He wasn't just intelligence. He was OSS, Office of Strategic Services. He ran operations all over Europe before the war started, recruiting sources, building networks, trying to stop this whole thing before it began. He was one of the best we had. And that German officer back in the farmhouse, Kellner, he was Mitchell's most valuable source. Gave us everything, Berlin's war plans, troop movements, everything, until he got reassigned to the Eastern Front and lost contact. Eddie felt something shift in his chest. Mitchell came back to find him. The lieutenant nodded. "Last month. Dropped behind enemy lines to make contact, see if the network could be reactivated. But the Germans were waiting. Ambush. Mitchell was killed. And Kellner," he paused. "Kellner couldn't live with it. Couldn't live with the fact that his friend died trying to save him." Eddie looked down at the stream where Mitchell's body had lain. "So the Feldgendarmerie officer was trying to return Mitchell's body to us as proof. Proof that Kellner wasn't a traitor." The lieutenant's voice was quiet. "Or proof that some men still believe in honor, even in the middle of hell." He walked away, leaving Eddie standing on the ridge in the cold wind. Kowalski sat down heavily on a fallen log. "Eddie, what you did back there, letting them surrender instead of taking the shot, that wasn't standard operating procedure." Eddie sat down beside him. "No, it wasn't." The kid looked at him. "Why'd you do it?" Eddie thought about that. About Mitchell and Kellner and the Feldgendarmerie officer. About men who'd tried to stop a war before it started, and died trying. About families that would live or die based on what information got reported and what didn't. Because some fights are worth more than killing, kid. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone live. Kowalski nodded slowly, not really understanding but accepting it. They sat there in silence as the sun started to set, painting the valley in shades of gold and red. Down below, the American soldiers were loading Mitchell's body into an ambulance. They did it carefully, respectfully, like he was still alive, and might feel the bumps in the road. The German prisoners sat in a separate truck, guarded but not mistreated. The Feldgendarmerie officer sat with his head down, his hands bound in front of him. Eddie wondered what would happen to him. To all of them. The lieutenant had promised protection, but promises were fragile things in wartime. Eddie hoped they'd be kept, hoped that somewhere in all this death and destruction, someone would remember that these men had tried to do something good, something that mattered, even if it failed, even if nobody ever knew. The lieutenant came back one more time as the convoy was preparing to move out. He looked at Eddie with an expression that was hard to read. "Corporal Brennan, I did some checking on you. Called back to division." Eddie's stomach tightened. "Sir?" The lieutenant smiled slightly. "You're not just a sniper, are you? You're OSS too. Mitchell's backup, the failsafe in case the operation went sideways." Eddie didn't confirm or deny. The lieutenant nodded. "That's why you knew not to take the shot. That's why you knew exactly how to handle this situation. You were trained by Mitchell himself." Eddie looked away. "Captain Mitchell was a good man, sir." The lieutenant clapped him on the shoulder. "He was, and he trained you well. We'll make sure his death meant something." After the lieutenant left, Kowalski turned to Eddie with wide eyes. "You're OSS? You've been OSS this whole time?" Eddie stood and picked up his rifle. "I'm a sniper, kid, that's all that matters." But Kowalski shook his head. "No, you're something more than that. You knew what to do back there because you've done it before. You've run these kinds of operations. You've made these kinds of calls." Eddie looked at him. "And now you know why I don't talk about it. Some things are better left in the dark." He started walking back toward the American lines. Kowalski followed, still processing everything. "So all those kills, the 37 confirmed, that was just your cover?" Eddie stopped. "Those kills were real, kid, and they mattered. Every single one. Just like the lives we saved today mattered." They walked back through the forest as night fell. Behind them, the convoy moved out, carrying Mitchell home, carrying the German prisoners to uncertain fates, carrying the secrets of men who'd tried to stop a war and failed. Eddie thought about the letter in the lieutenant's pocket, about the names it contained, about the families who would live because that letter would be buried, classified, forgotten. He thought about Mitchell, who died trying to save a friend, about Kellner, who'd killed himself rather than betray everyone he loved, about the Feldgendarmerie officer, who'd risked everything to return a body and keep faith with a man he'd known before the world went mad. And Eddie understood something he hadn't before, that the real war wasn't fought with rifles and bullets. It was fought in moments like these, in choices, in the space between what orders said to do and what conscience demanded. When they reached the American perimeter, Kowalski turned to him one last time. "Eddie, if you ever need anything, if you ever need someone who understands, I'm here." Eddie nodded. "I know, kid, I know." They went back to their unit in silence. The next morning, Eddie's orders came through. He was being reassigned. New mission, new theater. The kind of orders that didn't come with explanations or details, just coordinates and a date. Eddie packed his gear and prepared to move out. Before he left, he walked to the tent where Mitchell's body lay, waiting for transport home. He stood there for a moment, silent, remembering the man who'd taught him that being a soldier meant more than following orders. It meant knowing when to pull the trigger and when to hold fire, when to kill and when to save, when to follow the book and when to write your own ending. Eddie left the tent and walked into the morning light. Somewhere in a prisoner camp, the Feldgendarmerie officer and his men were starting new lives. Somewhere in Berlin, families slept safely, not knowing how close they'd come to destruction. Somewhere in Washington, Mitchell's letter was being filed away in a vault, its secrets preserved and protected. And somewhere in the Belgian forest, frost was covering the ground where men had stood and made impossible choices. Eddie shouldered his rifle and moved forward into whatever came next, carrying those choices with him, carrying the weight of lives saved and lives lost, carrying the knowledge that sometimes the bravest thing a sniper could do was let the enemy get close and choose not to fire, choose mercy over vengeance, choose tomorrow over yesterday, choose hope over hate. If this story reminded you of someone you knew, someone who served or someone who made hard choices when it mattered most, take a moment and subscribe. These stories deserve to be remembered. The men who lived them deserve to be honored. And sometimes in the telling we find pieces of ourselves, pieces of courage and conscience that remind us what it means to be human, even in the middle of war. Stay with us. There are more stories like this, the kind that don't make it into history books but should, the kind that old veterans used to tell over coffee when the memories came back and needed to be spoken aloud. We're keeping those memories alive, one story at a time.